In a quiet village troubled by strange night whispers, fear spread like a shadow. Miss Marple gently uncovers that there were no ghosts at all, only misunderstandings, and the peace that comes from understanding. I am your host, Elias, and I welcome you to the series of scientific mysteries by Driftaway Tales. To encourage us, please subscribe this channel. Let's begin the story. Chapter 1, Arrival in Rowanford. The train slowed gently into Rowanford Station, the wheels sighing across the rails, the way one exhales after a long day. The air outside was cool, touched with the scent of damp leaves and distant apple orchards. Miss Marple stepped down onto the small platform, coat neatly buttoned, hat tilted just enough to keep the evening breeze from troubling her hair. Rowanford was the sort of village where time seemed to pause, unsure whether to continue forward or stay comfortably where it was. She had come at the invitation of an old acquaintance, Mrs. Lydia Harrow, who had written in careful handwriting, "Do visit, Jane. The evenings have grown strange here, and I would feel steadier knowing you are close." Miss Marple had not asked for details. Lydia was not one to dramatize. If she wrote, "Come," there was reason. The station master nodded politely. No chatter. No welcome. Just a quiet acknowledgment, as though sound itself had become something to be cautious with. Miss Marple noticed at once. The village lane wound gently from the station toward the houses, lanterns glowing softly behind lace curtains. Yet the windows all shut a bit too firmly, the doors fastened just a little too quickly. The village was not bustling, nor sleeping. It was waiting. Miss Marple walked slowly, deliberately, the kind of slow walking that sees everything. The way curtains shifted when someone peeked and withdrew. The faint echo of footsteps behind her that never quite matched her own. A hush that was not silence, but held breath. Halfway down the lane, a small boy, no more than 8, stood by a gate with a lantern too large for his hands. He stared at her with wide, steady eyes. "You're the lady who isn't afraid," he said quietly. Miss Marple smiled gently. "People often say that when they mean the lady who listens." The boy blinked, thinking about that. "You shouldn't be outside now, not when it gets dark." "And why is that?" Miss Marple asked. His voice dropped to a whisper small enough to almost vanish. "Because the night here listens back." Before Miss Marple could reply, his mother pulled him inside, shutting the door with the soft urgency of someone who has practiced being afraid. The lane became still again. Lydia Harrow's home was warm, a neat cottage with shelves full of books, a little fern in the window, and a kettle just finishing its quiet simmer. Lydia embraced Miss Marple with the relief of someone who had been carrying a worry alone for too long. "You came," Lydia breathed. "Of course," Miss Marple answered. "Now tell me, what is it that has settled itself over the village?" Lydia poured tea with careful hands. "It began 2 months ago," she said, "just after the first frost. People say they hear footsteps at night, slow steps, as if someone is walking outside their homes, but no one is there when they look." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And when did they begin believing it was not a person at all?" she asked. "When we began hearing the humming," Lydia said, voice tightening. "A low sound like something breathing beneath the earth, especially near the old churchyard." Miss Marple did not interrupt. She let Lydia speak. "Children are being kept inside after sunset. Doors are bolted. People whisper more than they speak. It is as though the whole village is waiting for something to reveal itself." Miss Marple stirred a single sugar into her tea, very gently. "And what do you believe it is?" she asked. Lydia held her breath for a moment, then said softly, "I don't believe in ghosts, Jane. But I do believe in fear." Miss Marple smiled, warm, knowing, unbearably gentle. Then we are beginning in the right place. That night, Miss Marple sat by the window of the small guest room. The moon hung low above the orchard, pale and cream-soft, touching the rooftops with silver. She did not try to sleep. Some things reveal themselves only when silence has been invited politely. The house settled, small creaks, wood adjusting to the night. The wind passed gently between hedges. An owl gave its short, questioning call. Then she heard it, a footstep, slow, measured, not hurried, not heavy, but unmistakably a step, not on the path, not on the threshold, but somewhere very near the window. One step, a long pause, another. Miss Marple did not rise. She simply listened with the patience of someone who has listened all her life. The steps continued for perhaps a minute, maybe two, then grew fainter, until they dissolved into the soft breathing of the night. She smiled faintly. "Not a ghost," she murmured. "Not grief. Something structural, something physical, something ordinary dressed in fear." She closed her notebook softly. In the morning, Lydia found her already awake, placing a shawl neatly over a chair. "You heard it," Lydia said quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And I believe others have heard it too, not just once, but repeatedly." Lydia nodded. "Every household. And no one has tried to observe the sound itself?" Miss Marple asked. "No, everyone is too frightened." Miss Marple took her coat. "Then we shall observe." They walked through the village in daylight. The orchard looked peaceful, the church quiet, the houses simply houses, no menace, no mystery. Miss Marple paused beside a cottage wall. Old timber frame, stone foundation, wooden beams dried by summers and chilled by winters. She tapped lightly. The wood responded with a soft pop. The exact spacing and weight of the footsteps from the night. Lydia gasped. "It's the night cold," Miss Marple said. "Old houses shift as temperature falls. Wood contracts, stone settles. It sounds remarkably like a person walking." Lydia placed a hand over her mouth, not frightened, relieved. "So the footsteps—" "Yes," Miss Marple smiled. "But we will not tell the village yet. Fear does not dissolve by correction, only by understanding." They continued toward the church. Behind them, daylight touched the cottage roofs like a calm exhale. The night, for the first time, did not seem quite so large. Chapter 2. What the night was saying. The village told its story badly in daylight, and far too well after dark. By morning, rumor had grown legs, and facts had mislaid their shoes. Miss Marple made tea, wrote 3 sensible questions on an index card, and began house by house, not to argue with fear, but to sort it. What time did the dread begin? Where were you standing? What did you hear first? At the baker's cottage, Mrs. Trent confessed that the panic came like a hand from the floorboards, while she kneaded at 9:30. At the ferry cot, old Mr. Pike swore the dread arrived at exactly 10, when the tide turned, as if the river remembered a debt. 2 children, independently and with grave importance, reported that the lane near the fallen elm made your bones feel wobbly after their mothers called them in. Miss Marple sketched a little map as she walked, tiny crosses where unease woke, tiny notes in the margin, window open. Stove lit, lane narrow, chimney tall. She did not say ghosts, and nobody said it back. When Thomas Howe, the schoolmaster, joined her with a pack of squares ruled for graphs and the brisk humility of a young man rescuing his own courage, she handed him a pencil and the index card. "Ask exactly these," she said, "and write the answers as if they were arithmetic." Dr. Celine Park met them at the churchyard gate, carrying a canvas satchel that rattled the way good tools do when they like their work. "I brought a barometer, 2 sound meters, and a heart," she said dryly. "Which shall we use first?" "The heart," said Miss Marple, "to sit with people while they remember precisely. The meters we will try on the lanes." They split their morning between listening and measuring. The sound meters read like shy birds numbers that rarely posed, until they reached the narrow path by the disused mill. There, without traffic or conversation, the redoubt bloomed at the lowest end, a presence below hearing. Park frowned. "Sub-bass," she said. "Not loud felt. Wind across a broken opening, perhaps, or a concealed pump." "Note the time the dread begins," Miss Marple said. Thomas wrote 21:30 to 22:15 strongest complaints in his neat hand. "And below that wind from the northeast," Miss Marple added, looking at a windsock someone had once nailed to their memory. By early afternoon, the trio had made a circle of the village and returned every story with fewer adjectives. Lydia Reinhardt, called from the parish archive by the happy scent of a puzzle, brought old maps and council minutes with edges like toast. "The mill sluice was boarded in '74, she reported, "and there's a culvert under the lane that was supposed to be capped, She laid one map over another and traced with a finger. Here the old cider press vents. Here the new cold room fan at Rook's grocer. Here the culvert mouth. If the night wind is right, you have a flute the size of a parish." "Flutes make music," Thomas protested. "Only if the hole is friendly," Lydia smiled. "Otherwise they make complaint." Miss Marple looked out the vestry door at the sky's pale coin. "And we have another instrument," she said. "People, they report dread at times that are almost the same and always in narrow places. We will test after dark, and we will be kind while doing it." Park sorted her satchel. "I can log infrasound," she said, "though not perfectly outdoors. I can also bring a CO detector. Carbon monoxide makes people anxious in rooms with old stoves." "Bring both," Miss Marple said. "We'll watch the lanes and the chimneys." They agreed a plan with the frankness of menders. Thomas would station himself by the fallen elm at 9, with a notebook and a thermos, counting how often the hedgerow trembled when the wind changed. Park would take the mill lane with the meters, logging what the air confessed. Miss Marple would move from cottage to cottage, where dread had called most reliably, and simply sit by the stove for 5 minutes, watching the flame and the faces and the little CO device that speaks only truth. "If there is a ghost," she added, "it will have to put its sheet on over figures." Night came like a careful curtain. At 9 the wind arrived from the northeast in that practiced way English winds have of knowing their lanes. Thomas on his bench felt it first down his sleeves and along his teeth. He marked the time, 21:12 breeze. 21:14 leaves go still. 21:15 low trembling in the sternum without sound. The meter on Park's belt ticked upward in the band below hearing, like a rumor you feel before you know why. She moved the sensor under the old mill arch. Numbers flirted, then flirted harder. 17 hertz, she said softly to nobody, and wrote it down as if telling a magistrate. At Mrs. Trent's, Miss Marple accepted tea and the worry that came with it. "It's the hour," the baker's wife whispered, looking at the stove. "It's the minute the dough is done." The CO device remained silent and honest. The flame burned blue, respectable as a vicar. But the kitchen window, half open because good bread requires night air, let the lane's breath creep across the floor. Miss Marple felt it like a cat slipping past. Her throat tightened without fear. Her heart made 2 extra notes. She noted the time, smiled at the stove, as if it were a child caught nearly fibbing, and stood to close the window 2 inches. The dread of thin lace at the edge of things receded the width of those inches. "Sometimes," Miss Marple said, "the difference between panic and peace is a window latch." At the laying, Park found the culvert mouth, a hole half choked by reeds, framing air like a bad instrument. She held the meter to it and watched the graph nod in a frequency that makes animals change fields and people call their mothers. "There you are," she said, "a ghost's tuning fork." Thomas marked a parallel. Whenever the meter rose, the children's hedgerow across the green quivered with a sympathetic rustle, as if the village itself were an instrument strummed wrongly. He drew a tiny diagram with arrows and wrote standing wave between covert and stone wall. "Tomorrow," he said aloud to the dark, "we'll break the note." They reconvened at 10 in the vestry, where Lydia had set out biscuits as if figures were improved by butter. "They are." Park laid the meter on the table. Its small screen still wore the lane's signature like a smudge. Thomas reported his timing's hedge shivers at 14, 27, 41, and Miss Marple read out her list of chimneys. 2 safe, 1 sulky, 1 possibly dangerous, where a family had stuffed the flue with old newspapers last Christmas and forgotten. "Causes," Park said, ticking them off like sensible sins. "Infrasound from covert and fan alignment. Narrow lanes reflecting low frequency. 1 or 2 stoves that need forgiveness. And people who are excellent amplifiers when tired." "Remedies," Miss Marple answered. "Unblock the culvert or soften its edge. Time the grocer's fan to sleep at 9. Remind chimneys that they are chimneys. Place benches where lanes are narrow so people can sit while their hearts stop being tutored by air." Thomas grinned, young again. "May I teach the children the word infrasound tomorrow?" he asked. "It will make them feel like scientists." "Teach them the word rest first," Miss Marple said. "Then teach them where to put it." Sir Rowland, who had appeared in the doorway in ministerial tweed and unministerial humility, nodded at the meter as though greeting a cousin. "If you can cure a village with eggshells and benches," he said, "I shall fund both." He took off his hat because the vestry makes truth easier. "No ghosts, then?" "Only the ones made by air and habit," Miss Marple said. "We will introduce better habits. The air we will ask Mr. Roper to correct." "Snug, not proud," Thomas added, already quoting the plumber's proverb. Sir Rowland smiled. "I prefer a policy that fits on a teacup. Write me one." "We'll write you a list," Miss Marple said. "You may print it on benches." They ended the watch not with speeches, but with small correctives. Park and Thomas walked with Mr. Roper to the culvert and wedged a curve of timber against its lip to change the wind's story. The meter's low line dropped a shade. "Tomorrow we'll make it pretty," Roper promised. "Tonight it can be true." Miss Marple returned to Mrs. Trent and moved the bread table 3 inches away from the window. Dread did not enter with the yeast. She knocked at the cottage with the stuffed flue and stood by the open door while the family hauled out the Christmas news. The CO device blinked its contentment. "If you must fear," she told the mother gently, "fear only stoves you have not cleaned." On her way home she paused on the narrow lane by the fallen elm. The air, once bossy, felt like air again, useful, uninterested. A hedgehog, insulted by nothing, went about his urgent business. Miss Marple listened for the villages, heartbeat and found only her own. At her cottage she set her enameled jug on the table and cracked the window, a moral amount. The ring she made with her fingertip went outward without persuasion. No inward tremor came ahead of it. She wrote 3 new lines on the index card and set it by the lamp for morning. Causes: wind plus shape plus tired hearts. Tools: spanner, bench, timetable for fans. Method: ask, measure, be kind. Fix the note, then the story. Then she poured a small sip to the saucer of cress, as she always did when the night wished to be treated like a person, and let the village sleep without ghosts, because none had been invited and none had been required. Chapter 3. The Map of Night. The village pretended to be ordinary by day and failed politely at night. Doors that laughed at drafts in the afternoon became philosophers after dusk. Rafters composed arguments. Lanes rehearsed footsteps that had no feet. Miss Marple, who trusted the honesty of small things, began by drawing a map not of streets, but of sounds. She marked where Mr. Rook's dog flattened its ears at nothing, where the publican's glasses chimed without help, where a baby woke at the same minute each night and decided there were too many corners in the room. She noted the empty orchard where the wind went in obediently and came out nervous, and the bend by the old mill where even the moon seemed to walk soft. Lydia Reinhardt brought history in her satchel as if it were bread. The Mills sluice was bridged in 1897, she said, laying out charcoal drawings of arches and culverts. There's an old flue here, hollow stone, to pull fumes away from the wheel pit. When the wheel stopped, the flue stayed, because no one remembers to demolish what behaves. Her pencil tapped a hatch-marked rectangle. If night wind threads this throat, it could sing. Not for people, Miss Marple said, for houses. Then houses repeat. Thomas Hall, the schoolmaster, arrived with a borrowed tuning fork and the expression of a man determined to be useful without being clever. He struck the fork, set it humming on the millstone, and felt the air change its mind. The fork's note faded. A lower breath continued where no sound should. "I can't hear it," he said, "but my shirt has decided to be a drum." Miss Marple's eyes warmed. "Infrasound," she murmured. "The kind that makes curtains confess." She added a circle to her map around the mill and wrote, in her precise hand, "People hear without hearing here." Dr. Selim Park came from the Institute with a canvas case full of devices that preferred decimals. She placed a slim microphone on the mill threshold, another at the orchard stile, a third on the vicarage step, and one because Miss Marple asked for it politely on the shelf beside the harrow's sleeping baby. "We'll let the night draw its own graph," Park said. "If there's infrasound, we'll see it as pressure without pitch." Reverend Armitage, who held the parish like a teacup firmly, warmly, without show, offered the vestry as headquarters. "You will want a kettle," he said. "Numbers boil better with tea," Miss Marple smiled. She had already noticed that the kettle sang less sharply after dusk, as if the spout feared being overheard. They set the first watch. At 9, the mill lane felt like a throat-clearing. Parks, Trace crawled along the paper with good manners, and then, at a breeze that would not have troubled a veil, dipped and rose in a slow wave. "There," she said. 17 hertz, too low for the ear, just right for the ribs. She shifted the sensor to the covert mouth. The wave grew taller, like a cat encouraged. "Hollow stone acting as a pipe," Park murmured. "And the slot at the top, a whistle too big to hear," Miss Marple finished, "but big enough to persuade a room to remember." The orchard censer chimed in quiet by day, now perfumed with the same low breath. Leaves did not move. Apples remembered being windfall before they fell. On the baby's shelf, the trace lifted at 2:13, dipped at 2:17, lifted again at 2:19. "The same minutes as Mrs. Harrow's lamplight clicks," Miss Marple said softly. "Houses keep time with their neighbors when they are not watched." They walked home by a lane that refused to narrate itself. Miss Marple stood in her borrowed cottage and waited. At exactly the minute the mill trace had risen, the enamel jug on her table made a ring too slow to be seen and too certain to be denied. She added a mark to her map. "Jug agrees." Fear fattens on language. Miss Marple refused to feed it adjectives. She fed it facts. In the morning she showed Lydia's drawings to Mr. Roper, the handyman who repaired things by listening to their excuses. "Old flue," he said, delighted. "What's a felt tongue and a shame cap?" he meant. Pad the lip, cover the slot, teach the stone to stop singing through its teeth. Park, cautious even when she was right, proposed a test that had the smell of science and the courtesy of play. "We'll politely silence the flu for one night," she said. "No announcement. If the village forgets to be afraid, we're on the right path." She prepared sandbags to hush the covert mouth and a strip of canvas to lie between wind and stone. Thomas recruited lanterns and 2 lads who could carry and not tell. Lydia produced an 1899 note from the millwright complaining of winter moaning when the wheel stood. In the margin he had written, "Stuffed it with rags for Christmas." Miss Marple tapped the line with a fingernail. "We will be rags for Christmas." They went at dusk. Mr. Roper climbed like sensible ivy, pressing the canvas into place with wooden pegs that did not argue. Sandbags settled with homely thuds. Park watched her trace flatten like a sheet shaken and made neat. The air around the mill tried to remember the note and failed politely. "Not cured," Park said, "but prevented." Miss Marple nodded. "The difference is mercy. The result is the same." They left without telling anyone. Fear dislikes being surprised, but it despises being expected. The village slept as villages do when roofs are not asked to be organs. Mrs. Harrow woke once out of habit and laughed without sound. The baby breathed as if she had invented it. Thomas dreamt of sums that added themselves without his stern look. In the pub, glasses chimed only when convinced. The landlord, unused to not rehearsing an anecdote, fell asleep in a chair and did not mind. At dawn, Park unrolled her traces in the vestry. Where the slow waves had climbed the page like careful hedgehogs, there were now straight lanes. "The map of night has forgotten its hills," she said. The orchard line did not perfume itself with pressure. The baby's shelf stayed obediently boring. The enamel jug in Miss Marple's cottage produced 2 calm outward rings and declined to be interesting. "Then our culprit is not a ghost," Reverend Armitage said, who had never believed in villains except the ordinary sort. "It is a pipe that forgot to stop being a throat." Miss Marple, who had known since the first dog flattened its ears that this was about listening more than seeing, lifted her teacup in a small salute. "Now we change prevented into mended," she said, "and we teach the village a phrase it can use whenever shadows grow adjectives. We will check the throat of the wind." Sir Rowland Keene, alerted by nobody and arriving because bureaucracy loves the smell of a conclusion, appeared precisely when the kettle boiled. "Am I late?" he asked. "You are just in time to fund felt," Miss Marple said, which was both joke and instruction. Park handed him a page with 3 sentences a minister could read aloud without stumbling. Problem: subaudible resonance from abandoned mill flue. Intervention: pad and cap to disrupt standing wave. Result: reduction of nocturnal arousal events. Subjective improvement in mood. Kettle ceased to preach. Sir Rowland read, blinked, and nodded. "Benches, not fences," he said, remembering a previous lesson out loud. "And now quiet throats, not loudspeakers." They went back to the mill in daylight with tools that knew their names. Mr. Roper fitted a proper cap over the flue. Lined with felt snug, not proud, Park sealed the seam with a putty that had learned humility. Thomas painted the cap with leftover ministry gray, which pleased Sir Rowland more than it should. Lydia chalked a small note inside the arch where only future menders would see. "If it groans again, teach it to swallow." Reverend Armitage offered. No prayer, he saved those for people, but he put a hand on the stone as one greets a neighbor who has stopped shouting. Miss Marple stood at the bend where the lane accepted the river and let the wind go past her without making her a drum. "There," she said, to no one and to everyone. "Now that the night is not persuading the houses to be nervous, we can see what fear belonged to people. and what belonged to wind. Park packed her case. "We'll keep the sensors one more night," she said. "Numbers like goodbyes." Miss Marple folded her map of sounds, the dog, the glasses, the baby, the jug, and wrote along the bottom edge, in a hand anyone could read, "Not haunted." Resonant, to be treated with felt and manners. Then, because mysteries prefer to be finished kindly, she added a second line. "When frightened, check the wind's throat first. If it's clear, offer tea." Chapter 4. The House That Remembered Fear. The night after the mill flue was padded, Roanford felt like a village that had loosened its shoulders. The air no longer pressed itself against window panes. The hedges swayed as hedges do, not as messengers of dread. Yet fear, once taught, does not leave merely because the wind has been corrected. Some houses remember longer than others. Miss Marple, tea-tray in hand, went to visit Mrs. Alden, who lived in a tidy white cottage with lace curtains and a habit of worrying the hem of her apron. Mrs. Alden had been one of the first to insist something walked the night. Even now, with the mill silenced, she held the claim with a tremor of certainty. "They're saying everything is fixed," she said, her voice too bright. "But I still hear it. Last night. The footsteps. Just outside my wall." Miss Marple nodded without denial. "Tell me exactly where you heard them." Mrs. Alden led her to the sitting room, a warm space lined with embroidery and family photographs. The wall facing the orchard bore a long wooden baseboard, darker in one place from polishing. She placed a hand there. "It comes from right behind here. Only at night. Only when I am alone." Miss Marple placed her own hand on the paneling. The wood was cool, but not cold, like something that had been tense and was learning to let go. "Do you lock your windows tightly?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Alden said. "Every night, twice." "And the stove?" Miss Marple asked, glancing toward the kitchen. "Banked and closed?" Miss Marple smiled. "Good. Then we shall simply listen." She sat in the armchair. Mrs. Alden sat, too, hands clasped tightly. The room was quiet, but not silently, so it was full of waiting. Miss Marple spoke very softly. "Sometimes fear lingers not because it is correct, but because it has been believed for so long that it forgets how to stop." Mrs. Alden's hands loosened a fraction. As dusk arrived, Miss Marple lit the room's lamp low, not bright enough to chase shadows, but warm enough to soften corners. She poured tea, slow and gentle. "We are not here to catch a ghost," she said. "We are here to greet a sound. Think of it as a house clearing its throat." Mrs. Alden gave a nervous laugh. "If you say so." The night cooled, the trees outside stilled. Then, tap, 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 soft, deliberate, exactly like footsteps moving along the outer wall. Mrs. Alden's breath caught. "There it's happening." Miss Marple raised one finger. She closed her eyes. She listened not with fear, but with curiosity. The tapping was not uneven, not aggressive, not approaching. It was rhythmic, 3 seconds apart, always in the same place. A metronome. Not a foot. Miss Marple stood quietly and went to the wall. She pressed lightly. The wood answered with a small, hollow resonance. Then she bent down and placed her ear near the baseboard. A faint whisper of air drifted across her cheek. A draft. "You keep your stove vent open a crack at night to keep the air fresh, I believe?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Alden blinked. "Oh, yes. My mother always did. She said night air keeps a house from growing old." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Quite true. But old wooden houses, when they cool at night, shift. And when the vent is drawing air, the wall contracts against the cold. The wood adjusts in small increments. It sounds like footsteps because fear has already named it footsteps." Mrs. Alden's eyes widened as though something untied inside her. "So I have been hearing my house breathing?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and asking to be warmed a bit earlier in the evening." She turned up the radiator just slightly. The tapping soft, then stopped entirely. Mrs. Alden stared at the wall as if it had just apologized. Miss Marple poured her more tea. The next morning Miss Marple met Dr. Park and Thomas at the Green. "It continues," Miss Marple said, "but not as dread. Now it is memory. A few houses still need to relearn their nights." Thomas, who carried maps like other people, carried umbrellas, pointed to 3 cottages, Mrs. Alden's, the Bronmores, and the millkeeper's lodge. "All with older beams," Park said thoughtfully. "Same expansion and contraction patterns." Miss Marple nodded. "But there is another part. The footsteps did not frighten anyone, not at first. The fear spread after the story spread." Lydia joined them with the parish record book. "Yes, it began with Mr. Fenwick telling the tale at the pub. He only meant to tease. But he described the sound as though it were a person waking in the dark, searching for someone it remembered." Miss Marple smiled. "Stories are excellent at arranging furniture inside the mind." Park folded her arms. "Then we must replace the story." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "Not with correction, but with a kinder story." Thomas brightened. "A story of houses that breathe at night, of wood that sighs." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "Something true, and gentle, and unafraid." Park raised her eyebrows. "We're going to cure superstition with bedtime stories?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It is how most superstitions were created. It seems only fair to let kindness write the next one." That afternoon, Miss Marple invited villagers to the Green, not for a meeting, not for a lecture, but for tea outdoors where the sunlight could sit politely in everyone's lap. She told a small tale. Once, long ago, houses were built of living wood, and wood, like all things that once lived, remembers how to breathe. At night, when the cold comes, the wood sighs and settles. This is not a haunting. It is a house saying, "I have endured another day and would like to rest now." And if you listen kindly, you will find that every house has its own lullaby. The villagers did not laugh. They leaned in, because the new story was gentler than the old one, and people always choose gentleness if given the chance. The fear loosened, not snapped, not shattered, just loosened, like a knot rediscovering softness. That night, Rowanford did not force itself to be brave. Doors still closed, lamps still dimmed, but no one held their breath. Mrs. Alden sat by her window and listened. She heard her house breathe, not footsteps, not a presence, just wood settling into night. She smiled. In another cottage a child told her father, "Don't worry. The house is just sleeping." At the mill lane, the culvert no longer sang its low, aching note. It merely existed, like stone does when it has been understood. Miss Marple wrote in her notebook, "Fear leaves slowly, but understanding arrives all at once." She set her pencil down. The night outside was simply night again, wide, quiet, harmless. A companion rather than a watcher. The village slept without performing fear, and Miss Marple smiled, because that was the beginning of peace. Chapter 5. The Orchard of Moving Shadows. The orchard behind Rowanford stretched wide as a soft green quilt, stitched with rows of apple trees whose branches tangled like whispered stories. In daytime it was a place of baskets, laughter, and slow conversation. But at night villagers had sworn to seeing shadows move, figures drifting between trees, too tall to be children, too quiet to be thieves. These sightings had fed the fear as much as the footsteps and the humming. A whisper shared enough times begins to feel like remembering. Miss Marple decided to visit the orchard just before dusk. when light is soft enough to deceive but still honest. Lydia joined her, notebooks under her arm, and Thomas carried a lantern not yet lit. "I have always thought shadows are simply stories of light," Miss Marple said, as they walked between the rows. "They appear fearful only when we forget the source." Lydia nodded, though her eyes stayed wary. "But the villagers claim the shadows walk, slowly, purposefully." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "and that tells us something useful." Thomas looked hopeful. "That it's not imagination?" "That it is consistent," Miss Marple said gently, "which means it has a cause, one the night cannot hide once we are patient." They reached the center of the orchard, where branches leaned low, heavy with ripening apples. Miss Marple stopped, placed her gloved hand on one trunk, and waited. Not for the shadows, those would come, but for the wind. It arrived, a thin breeze, barely touching hair or fabric. The branches responded like dancers awakening. Shadows stretched across the ground, long, thin, almost human, and began to move. Lydia gasped softly. Thomas stepped closer to Miss Marple. The shadows swayed, lengthening and shortening, shifting forward, backward, folding in and out of themselves like slow conversation. In the fading light, their forms could easily be mistaken for figures walking between trees, heads bowed, arms folded behind backs. Miss Marple watched the rhythm, not random, not unnatural. Wind gives branch, gives shadow, gives ground. A simple sequence wearing the costume of mystery. "This orchard was planted on a grade," Miss Marple said quietly. "See how the land slopes downward there? The shadows lengthen faster on that side, and the branches, look closely, they move as if they are all answering one tree." Lydia followed her gaze. "Yes, the oldest apple tree at the far row. Everything bends away from it." Thomas blinked. "Why would all the others follow one tree?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "the oldest trees cast the longest memory. Their roots guide water. Their branches guide wind. The orchard is almost a single body. The trees are not separate, only separate shapes." Lydia considered this. "So the villagers are seeing the orchard breathe?" "Yes," Miss Marple smiled. "And because they believe something is watching them, they tell themselves the shadows walk toward them." Thomas raised his lantern, but Miss Marple rested a hand on his arm. "No light. Light will interrupt the lesson the shadows are trying to teach us." The orchard continued its gentle swaying. Not ghosts, not spirits, just trees whispering to one another in the language of dusk. Then came the proof. A cloud passed across the sun briefly. The orchard darkened a shade. The shadows grew twice as long in one breath. And the villagers who had once seen this moment had done exactly what frightened hearts do. They ran. Because when something changes suddenly and silently, the mind fills the uncertainty with whatever story it already fears. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Shadows change size with light. That is their nature. But when a village is already afraid, even the simplest laws of nature appear as messages." Lydia exhaled. "So the orchard never walked. The light did." "And the light will always walk," Miss Marple said, "but fear no longer needs to follow." Thomas looked at her with a dawning, humbled admiration. "You don't solve mysteries," he said. "You untangle them." "Fear rarely knots itself," Miss Marple replied softly. "People do that part. I simply loosen what has been pulled too tight." They stood quietly until the cloud passed, and the orchard returned to its gentle breathing. That evening, Miss Marple asked Lydia to gather a few villagers for a short walk, not a meeting, not a demonstration, simply a walk through the orchard at the same hour the shadows had frightened them. At first they hesitated, but Lydia's calm presence and Miss Marple's gentle voice carried weight. 8 villagers came. They walked in near silence, lanterns unlit, guided only by dusk and one another. The orchard began its slow shadow dance again. A murmur of unease rose, but Miss Marple spoke before fear could shape it. "Watch the branches," she said. "Not the shadows. Shadows only repeat what trees say." The villagers watched. Branches swayed. Shadows followed. Someone whispered, "It's only the wind." Another, "I thought I saw figures, but—" "I see it now. It's the trees speaking to each other." Miss Marple smiled quietly. No dramatic reveal, no lecture, just understanding forming where fear once sat. Mrs. Alden, who had been silent until now, stepped closer to a tree and touched the bark with tenderness. "It was never trying to frighten us," she whispered. "No," Miss Marple said. "It was merely being alive." The group returned to the village under the first stars of the evening. The air felt different, not emptied of mystery, but filled with gentle knowing. Fear had not been defeated. Fear had simply been replaced. At Lydia's gate, Miss Marple paused and looked back at the orchard. "People fear what moves without explanation," she said softly. "But once we understand the movement, we remember that the world has always breathed around us." Lydia touched her arm, quietly grateful. Thomas exhaled, long and slow, the kind of breath that releases a burden. That night the orchard danced again under the moonlight, but no one watched from shuttered windows. No curtains twitched, no hearts braced. The shadows were shadows again, which is to say, they were simply the earth speaking in its oldest language. And Rowanford at last was learning how to listen. Chapter 6. The Proof of Dark Air. They agreed to do what frightened people rarely do: sit still and take notes. At Miss Marple's suggestion, the village drew a rough circle on the map 4 lanes: the churchyard gate, the culvert by the heath, and the old mill road, where the hedges bent like listeners. Dr. Selene Park assembled, a modest arsenal that would not scare a cat: a barometer, 2 pocket thermometers, a phone with a low-frequency microphone, a CO detector borrowed from the infirmary, and a tangle of red cellophane for lamps. "Red preserves your night vision," she told Thomas, who nodded as if red had been his idea. Lydia carried the parish book for times and places. Reverend Armitage packed a thermos and the sort of hush that makes rooms decent. Miss Marple made the rules clear, kind, and impossible to disobey. No one was to be alone. No one was to tell the dark what it meant. If fear rose, count to 60 and write what you felt weight on the chest. A hum, a whine, a cold up the sleeves without adjectives. Adjectives panic early, she said. Facts arrive on time. She gave each pair 2 cords, one with little tin bells, one with plain string. If you hear the moan, hold them both. If you feel a push of dread, drop the string. If you only hear sound, drop the bells. They started at 10. The village switched off what it could pub quieter than pride. Parlors dimmed, workshop shutters settled, so the night might speak in its own register. Clouds parted. A thin moon looked on without volunteering opinions. At the lich gate, Miss Marple gave the last instruction, the one that mattered most. "We are listening to air, not to stories. Let the air have its say." At the heath culvert, Thomas and Lydia took first watch. The ditch stones gave off the day's hoard of cool. Hedgerow leaves showed their pale undersides like shy hands. A steady breath came from the culvert mouth, in and out, too slow for a person, too steady for accident. The red-covered lamp made everything polite. 17 beats, Lydia whispered after counting. Long inhale, short exhale. As if the hill borrows breath and gives it back, cheaper. Thomas, whose mind kept tidy rooms for science and folklore, wrote 17-count cycle and resisted the urge to name it. The low-frequency mic sketched a soft hump near 18 hertz below hearing, inside feeling. Thomas pressed his fingers to his sternum and felt the echo there, not loud, insistent. The fear did not come as a jump. It poured in like thin water, a cold that was not on his skin. He dropped the plain string. The bells stayed in his palm. "Body, not ear," he said, trying to sound calm for Lydia, and discovering he was calm because Lydia was. They tried a trick Miss Marple had recommended. Step 3 paces left, 3 right, hats off, hats on, lamp held high, lamp lowered. The hump rose and fell like a cat under a blanket strongest when they stood where the mill road's hedges narrowed into a throat. Lydia marked wind direction, noted the temperature near the culvert mouth and 10 paces away, a 2-degree drop that felt like a memory rather than weather. Micro-inversion, she breathed. Cold river breath trapped in a throat of hedges. Infrasound rides it. Thomas wrote hedge throat and smiled at himself. On the church lane, Park and the vicar kept the same exercise like courteous conspirators. The CO detector stayed steady on safe. The barometer needle trembled, then held. The mic found the same low swell when wind slid past the old grain silo vein at the hill's crown. "Helmholtz resonance," Park murmured. A bottle blown by a disobedient sky. Armitage tried the chords and felt nothing until the vein squealed on a slow pivot. Then a push in the ribs, a prickle behind the eyes. Bells silent, string gone. "Body says yes," he whispered. "Ear says not yet." Miss Marple took the mill road with Mr. Roper and Sister Birch. Because a road behaves for a spanner and a ward sister, if it behaves for anyone at all. The hedges pinched the lane into a small throat. Above, telephone wires drew a long black stave where wind could practice scales. A first moan came not ghostly, only ancient, where a cedar rubbed its dead branch against a barn corner. Roper touched the wood, and the moan stopped like a scolded hinge. "One voice," he said. "Not the choir." They tested the chords when a deeper sound arrived, felt more than heard. Miss Marple's fingers slackened on the plain string before the bells even thought to ring. Sister Birch, who distrusts both nonsense and hubris, squared herself to the lane and said, "There now," to nobody and everyone. The pressure lifted a fraction. "It's the breath," Miss Marple said, soft enough to keep the dark from taking offense. "The place is breathing through a bruise." They moved toward the old silo silhouette on the ridge. Decades had emptied it, but a rusted cap still sat at the top, loose in its housing. Wind set it turning, not quick, but with that terrible steadiness that persuades bone to listen. Roper shaded his eyes. "Cap needs a washer," he muttered, "and a word with its maker." Below, reeds by the drainage ditch bowed toward the culvert, leading the eye to a hole in the hedge hardly wider than a dog's hope. Miss Marple crouched and felt the exhale cool, patient, wrong in tempo. "A throat here and a mouth on the hill," she said. The moan passes between them like a sermon no one asked for. A rustle behind them turned out to be 2 lads as pale as apologies. Sister Birch fixed them with professional affection. "Spit it out." They produced a roll of tin sheet and a length of cord. They had been experimenting, they admitted, hanging tin from a branch to make the moan louder for thrills. Only sometimes miss honest. Roper took the sheet as if it were a catechism. "This goes to the vicarage shed," he said. "And you go home by your ears," Birch added. "Tomorrow you will help fix the cap." The boys agreed in the manner of souls who have met justice with tea. At midnight, the teams met at the lich gate like parts of a compass reunited. Park spread the notes. Times, when, where string fell, and where bells. Lines began to agree. When wind came north by east at anything above a sigh, the silo cap sang. When night air pooled low in the hedged lane, the culvert passed on the note. Where wires crossed the road, a second harmony joined. The fear arrived in body's first pressure. breath gone shallow, a shoulder laid shiver, and only after that did the ear invent ghosts to justify the heart's hurry. "We have 2 instruments and a throat," Park said. "A tuned cap and a culvert, with hedges making a resonant tunnel between." She tapped the map gently, as if to avoid waking a child. "Add prank metal, and you season the broth with mischief." Miss Marple wrote a sentence on the margin. "The village is not haunted. It is played." She glanced at Armitage. "Tomorrow the sermon is bolts and pruning." He smiled the tired smile of a man who enjoys telling parishioners to fetch ladders. "And benches," he said. "People breathe differently when seated." They went for one more pass. Miss Marple never trusts a tidy theory that hasn't walked in the dark. At the culvert the breath pressed again, and the string fell. Up on the ridge the cap groaned, and even Park felt her sternum argue. Then clouds thickened, wind shifted south, and like a hand leaving the top of one's head, the pressure eased. The lane gave them back their lungs, bells untouched, string in place. "Parameter changed," Park said, satisfied. "So does the story." They ended with tea in the vestry, which is how civilizations avoid foolish laws. Sister Birch poured. Roper drew a washer on Lydia's margin, snug, not proud. Thomas sketched a bench where wires crossed. Park listed tools: spanner, pruning saw, cork mat for the cap base. She added no recordings without looking at Sir Rowland, who was not present, but would be eventually. Miss Marple, last to write, made it plain. Morning. Cap tightened, hedges opened to break the throat, tin mischief confiscated with dignity. Evening. A seated walk to teach lungs how to ignore the old tune. She closed the book, as one closes a good day gently. Outside, the moon had found a cloud that understood it. The village stood where they'd left it. The air, for once, did not rehearse fear as habit. "Proof," Park said, collecting instruments. "Of dark air," Miss Marple agreed, rising, "and of how quickly people learn to borrow courage when you name the wind correctly." Chapter 7. The Night Test. They chose a night that every superstition would have circled in red: a falling barometer, a sea breeze coming inland in long, even breaths, and a moon so thin it behaved more like a rumor than a light. Miss Marple drank her tea without hurry and buttoned her coat. She did not take a torch. Thomas carried 2, and Dr. Celine Park had strapped a lantern to her satchel alongside a barometer, a pocket CO meter, a thermometer, a compass, a small audio recorder, and 3 lengths of red ribbon. Lydia had copied old parish notes into a pocketbook. Reverend Armitage brought a key to any door that still believed in him. Mr. Roper arrived with what he called a reasonable spanner and the easy stride of a man who knew where metal hid. They met at the lich gate as the last village window went dark. Somewhere in the hollow below a dog barked twice and then thought better of it. "Rule 1, Park said, cinching her satchel. "We separate causes. If dread comes, we want to know which instrument it travels with." "Rule 2, Miss Marple added. "We stay ordinary. Fear loves theater." Thomas handed out the ribbons. "Tie one at any spot where you feel it," he said. Not courage, not shame, information. They began with the lane that had made children run. It narrowed between cob and hedge and caught the breeze like a flute. Park held up the compass. The needle wavered a fraction and settled. "No magnetics," she murmured. Then she took out a cheap plastic tube-cut section of PVC, open at one end, a cork with a pinhole in the other, and held it like a schoolboy's recorder. "What is that?" Thomas whispered. "A poor woman's infrasonic telltale," Park said. "If air pressure swells and falls around 17 to 19 hertz, the tube will quiver and the thread inside will dance." "Which is also the frequency," Lydia said softly, "that makes people think doors breathe." Park smiled. "And sometimes that eyes on the lane are watching." They stood without speaking. The breeze thinned and gathered. The little thread inside the tube trembled, then wagged steadily, like a tail that did not belong to a dog. Park's shoulders rose. "There we are," she said. "Winged over the old kill ridge, striking this gap like a bottle lip. Low, steady, below hearing, directly inside hearing's house." Miss Marple listened with her bones, which had better memories than ears. A pressure like the thought of a headache pressed at her temples, and a feeling rose, the particular causeless unease that villages call presence, because admitting physics feels stingy. She marked a hedge with ribbon. "One," she said, "but dread is greedy. It will be looking for company." They turned toward the school path and the line of the old clay pits. The night gathered itself more thickly there. Reeds moved like men who disagreed. Park held the tube again. The thread slept. She tilted the recorder to capture the air, and saw its little screen shiver on the far left weight in the bass that notes do not carry, but rooms do. 19 hertz, she guessed. 18, perhaps, with the breeze. Thomas swung his torch across the hollow. The beam picked out a white flash and a soft, steady pallor that should not have been there. He stiffened. "There," he said. "Green-like." "Like foxfire," Lydia said, calm. She stepped off the path and parted the deadfall with a stick. Bioluminescent fungus on punky wood. The Romans would have called it an omen. The children will call it treasure. They watched the pale green floor lamp of nature burn without heat. "Put that beside infrasound," Park said, "and you have enough for 3 ghost columns in a newspaper. Or for 3 nightmares if a man returns drunk and discovers he is large." "Enough to fall," Miss Marple said. She tied a second ribbon to a branch, not to frighten it, only to remember where it had been beautiful and useless to panic about. They moved on to the row of cottages under the kill hill. Miss Marple paused where the lane pulled tight between 2 gables and sniffed. Not coal, not damp. A sweetness with teeth. "Stove?" she asked quietly. Thomas's torch found the tiny blue flicker behind a cracked pane in the back of number 4, a paraffin heater sulking on low, a towel thrown over a chair too near, a vent that had forgotten how. Park's CO meter filled the quiet with a soft alarm. "There," she said, the way a doctor says "ah" when a fever finally confesses. "Low-dose carbon monoxide. Not enough to kill. Enough to make a heart thrum, a head ache, a mind invent reasons at 2 in the morning." They woke no one. They opened the window a finger's width, slid the chair aside, and left Armitage's card in the latch with a note in Miss Marple's hand. "Your heater is lonely for air. Please let it have some in the morning. Mr. Roper promised at 8 to look at the flue with his spanner and a stare." 2 ribbons, Miss Marple said softly. "One for a lane that hums, one for a heater that sulks. We are building a quilt." They took the path that ran under the old factory wall, the one where voices had been reported in the small hours, coming and going like impatient spirits. The wall faced the breeze. The hedge on the far side made a throat. Park stood in the throat and raised her tube. The thread lifted, wagged, steadied. She handed the tube to Thomas. "Feel it in your hands," she said. He did, and his face changed, at once less embarrassed and more sober. "It's like a sound you can't hear, but you can disagree with," he said. "Like a rumor for your inner ear," Lydia added. Miss Marple placed her palm on the brick. It vibrated faintly under her skin, not a shake, a persuasion. "If you are a nervous child," she said, "or a quarrelsome man, the night will lend you an echo." They followed the wall to the mouth of a ventilation shaft, sunk when the factory baked tiles. A rusted grill crouched over the opening. Ivy had made a kind of green beard. Park crouched, slid her recorder in, and counted. The little screen drifted into that same left-hand fog of weight. 17, she said. The classic. Mr. Roper spat thoughtfully, which was his way of writing in a lab book. Grill's loose, he said. She flapped with a long breath, same as a sail. He took out a stub of soap and marked 2 bolts. If I pack felt here and here, she'll stop telling the night stories. Miss Marple nodded. Before you do, show the village what story was being told. They waited. In a minute the breeze strengthened, and the grill moved along sighing, not loud at all, but tuned to nerves. The ivy's leaves added a soft ticking as they touched. Lydia's face settled into comprehension. Thomas's shoulders lowered. Armitage shook his head gently. How many confessions did you hear, old Wall? He asked, not demanding an answer. 3 ribbons, Miss Marple said. Enough to make honest fear, not enough to justify gin. They turned homeward by the churchyard to test the last rumor. A ring of cold by the south stones where no weather had right to gather. Park held out the thermometer. The air there was 2 degrees lower than the path. A pooling of cool in a hollow men's boots had made and gravestones had kept. She took out a candle, lit it, and set it at ankle height. The flame leaned without wind. Drain draft, she said. Air, tugging through someone's forgotten pipe. It pulls at trouser legs and imaginations. Miss Marple felt the tug, and thought of all the times in all the villages people had called a tug-touch. She tied the 4th ribbon to the U. Let this be a courtesy, she said to the night. We are not correcting you. We are naming you. They stopped at the green for their last trial. Park set the recorder on the bench, the 2 beside it, and asked them all to sit 5 minutes without inventing sentences. The breeze came steady. The thread in the tube wagged. The recorder's left margin slept. The village held. Now, Miss Marple said at last, we walk past each ribbon again and admit its power. Then we decide what to do about it. They did. At the lane, they stood in the hum and let it pass through them and not own them. At the pit's foxfire, they admired what was strange and promised to show the children in daylight. At the cottage with the heater, they promised calls and fresh air. At the shaft, Mr. Roper promised felt and a better beard for the ivy. At the churchyard, Armitage promised to clear the drain mouth and flatten the hollow. None of it sounded like exorcism. It sounded like work. Back at the lich gate, Park closed her satchel and checked the numbers she hadn't needed. 18, she said. 19. And a little carbon monoxide. Enough to seed stories. She looked at Miss Marple. Tomorrow we publish our map. And tonight, Miss Marple said, we sleep like people who have looked under the bed. Thomas laughed, which took the last piece of theater away from the darkness. Lydia tucked the ribbons in her bag to press between paper and history. Armitage locked the church and left the key where keys feel useful, in an old pocket that had learned to carry mercy. Mr. Roper touched the grill, once, as if to tell it that dawn would be strict but polite. Miss Marple walked the last steps alone. The village lay like a cat that had remembered its house. In her window, the enamel jug held its little moon. She watched the surface. No inward twitch, no borrowed curtain of unease, only a ring outward when the mantel clock made its good small click. She wrote a sentence for the morning on a card and set it under the jug. What appears to be a ghost is sometimes wind learning a throat, fungus learning a lamp, and stoves learning to sulk. We will teach the throats, show the lamps, and open the stoves. Then she undid the top button of her coat, and the village exhaled with her. Chapter 8. The Meeting in the Village Hall. Morning arrived pale and cool, as if the village itself had slept more deeply than usual. The fear that once clung to Rowanford like a shawl had loosened, but it had not yet fallen away. People still spoke in lowered tones, as if quiet itself might break. Miss Marple understood. Understanding comes first. Belief comes later. Today was for belief. Sir Rowland Keene called a meeting at the village hall, a place with beams like old shoulders and windows that knew every sunrise since the century turned twice. The hall had seen weddings, wakes, parish debates, and one regrettable cheese festival. It now prepared to host something gentler explanation without embarrassment. Miss Marple stood near the front, her posture calm, not commanding. She never lectured. She invited. Dr. Celine Park arranged her instruments on a table sound meter, CO detector, tuning tube, and a folded map of last night's measurements. Thomas Hall brought charts drawn in his earnest hand, one for wind direction, one for low-frequency resonance, one for the ribbon spots. Lydia set out a blackboard with chalk ready not to teach, but to show. Reverend Armitage arranged tea on the side table. When the hall filled, there was no murmuring, only waiting. Miss Marple began with a sentence so gentle it barely disturbed the air. Fear is not foolish. Fear is the body's way of asking us to look more closely. Shoulders eased, just slightly. "And we have looked closely," Thomas said, stepping forward. "All of us." Dr. Park stepped to the map. "Here," she said, pointing to the culvert by the heath, "is where the low-frequency wind resonance begins. A natural flute formed by stone, hedge, and angle of breeze. The sound is too low for the ear, but the body feels it." She held up the small PVC tube from the night test. "When the wind passed the culvert last night, this thread inside danced. That is the same sensation many of you felt as dread, heaviness, or presence." Mr. Pike, who had reported hearing a voice calling his name, blinked twice, not wanting to insult his own memory, but beginning to understand. "It's not a voice," Park said softly. "It is pressure, not language. A sound below hearing that the heart misinterprets." Miss Marple added, "And because we did not yet know what caused the pressure, our minds reached for the first explanation available, the one we were already whispering." Mrs. Trenwith folded her hands. "We told the fear to each other." "Yes," Lydia agreed. "We told the story, and the story became the shape of the night." Thomas turned to the chalkboard. Across it he had written, "Fear begins in the body. Meaning is added by memory. Story decides the shape." The words were simple enough that even a child could follow. Children were following. Now came the orchard. Miss Marple walked to the chalkboard and drew a simple apple tree, then the angle of the ground, then the sun low in the sky. "When the orchard breathes with wind," she said, "the shadows stretch and move, the ground slopes. The branches sway, the shadows walk because the light walks." She lifted her hand toward the window. The morning sun cast her shadow across the floor longer than her real size. "If you are already afraid, this," she moved her arm, "looks like someone approaching." A quiet ripple of realization passed through the hall. "Shadows," she said gently, "are loyal. They only repeat the movements of the world." Mrs. Alden gave a small, decisive nod. "I saw the orchard again this morning," she said. "It was only trees all along. No one corrected her. No one said, of course. The village learned with her, not against her. Now for the part that required care, the cottage heater." Dr. Park held the CO detector aloft. "Carbon monoxide is invisible," she said. "It does not feel like poison. It feels like sadness, like nervousness, like something is wrong but can't be named." A hush fell because many recognized that feeling. Miss Marple continued, "Fear that has no story yet is the most powerful kind." And when the night was already full of murmurs, the feeling in the chest completed the pattern. Sir Rowland cleared his throat. So we were frightened because the wind played an instrument we didn't see, and because a few chimneys forgot their manners, and because our orchard speaks with shadows. Yes, Miss Marple said simply. Everything real, nothing imagined, except the meaning we gave it before we knew the cause. Silence followed, deep, steady, restful silence, the kind that feels like understanding. Miss Marple smiled softly. And now we know. Then came the moment of healing, not through proof, but through practice. Miss Marple stepped forward. This evening, she said, we will walk the village, together, not to test, not to challenge, simply to be outside at night without asking the night to frighten us. A slow murmur began not of fear, but of something gentler, hope. Reverend Armitage softened his voice. Not a vigil, not a ritual, just walking. And we may sit on the new benches while we do. Mr. Roper raised a hand. And by sundown that mill cap will be snug. Lydia added, we'll bring children. Children remember peace quicker than adults. And Thomas said, almost shyly, I'll bring a song, a quiet one. A few villagers laughed softly, not at him, but with relief. The meeting did not end with applause. It ended with chairs scraping gently, and warm hands touching shoulders, and doors opening into ordinary daylight, which suddenly felt larger than it had yesterday. Outside, the village green breathed like a chest that had stopped bracing. Miss Marple stood at the steps watching them go. Not triumphant, only peaceful, because the night had not been defeated. It had simply been understood. Chapter 9. The Walk Under the Thin Moon. News of the evening walk spread not with excitement, but with relief, as if the village had been holding its breath for weeks, and now remembered how to exhale. Mothers laid out shawls. Fathers checked lantern wicks, even though they would not be lit. Children, who learned faster than adults what not to be afraid of, asked if they could bring biscuits to feed the darkness, in case the night is lonely. Miss Marple stood at the green before sunset. She did not announce. She simply waited. People gathered because they wanted to, not because they'd been told. That distinction mattered. Fear forced, peace invited. Dr. Park set her instruments aside tonight was not for measuring. Thomas Howe carried only a folded notebook and a pencil. Lydia brought nothing but a warm scarf. Reverend Armitage carried no sermon, only quiet presence. Mr. Roper had already spent the afternoon securing the mill cap, patting the flue, and clearing the path near the culvert. His hands smelled of wood shavings and rain. The last light thinned into a lavender dusk. The moon hung like a silver comma, not finishing a sentence, only pausing one. Miss Marple nodded once. They began to walk. They took the orchard path first, not to challenge shadows, but to greet them. The apple branches moved like gentle thought. The long shadows stretched across the ground, but now, instead of humans trying to outrun them, humans walked beside them. Children ran between the trees, giggling, stepping deliberately on the shadows to prove they did not bite. Mrs. Alden watched the orchard bough with wind and said aloud, surprised, "It really does look like breathing." Miss Marple smiled. "It always did. Now you are watching instead of anticipating." The villagers listened not for sounds that foretold something, but for sounds that simply were. Wind and leaves, branches adjusting, grass brushing trousers, all ordinary, all harmless. A man who had once refused to walk the orchard lane after dusk now bent to pick up a fallen apple and handed it to his wife as though offering a confession. No grand pronouncement was needed. The orchard had been forgiven. Next came the lane between the hedges, the place where the infrasound had once pressed against the chest like invisible hands. Tonight the breeze was light. The hedges rustled gently. The air did not push it, moved around bodies instead of through them. But just to be sure, Dr. Park set the listening tube down at the narrowest point. The thread inside did not stir. No hum. No pulse of dread. Only night. Mr. Roper folded his arms, satisfied. "Cap's snug now," he said. "Flues padded, hedges trimmed. Wind's got nowhere to get clever." Thomas smiled. "Then the night has forgotten how to frighten us." Miss Marple shook her head, not correcting him, simply refining. "No, we have forgotten how to frighten ourselves." They continued on. A lantern flickered, though unlit just the glass-catching moonlight. No one imagined it a signal. No one whispered meaning into it. The night was doing nothing except being night. For the first time in a long time, that was enough. When they reached the churchyard, the cold spot by the south stones waited, as it always had. But now they knew what caused it. The air pulled through a narrow drain opening and pooled at ankle height. Standing there no longer made hearts race. It simply felt cool. Reverend Armitage placed a bench nearby, just as Miss Marple had suggested. "Sit," he said softly, as though speaking to children at story hour. "Let the night greet you." They did. The bench was smooth, newly sanded, warm from the afternoon sun. Mrs. Trent sat and sighed, a real sigh, not a frightened one. The vicar's dog nosed the grass and curled at his feet. Lydia leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder, without realizing she had, and Miss Marple, she closed her eyes and listened. Far away, an owl called once. The church bell settled its metal weight against the cool air. The world was not silent, but everything was still. No presence, no footsteps, no hum. Just a village in agreement with itself. When they returned to the green, the moon had risen high enough to make silver of the rooftops. The villagers did not disperse, not yet. They stood together in a loose circle, as if waiting to feel something dramatic. But Miss Marple shook her head gently and said the truest line of the night. "Peace does not arrive with drums, it arrives with recognition." No applause followed. No cheers, only breathing. Every person stood the way a child stands after being comforted. Sure again. Mrs. Alden wiped her eyes, not because she was sad, but because relief sometimes exits the body like rain. Mr. Pike laughed in that startled way that means someone has just remembered joy. Two children fell asleep against their mother's coat, heads touching. The fear had finally let go of them. Dr. Park began packing her unused instruments. Thomas closed his notebook without writing anything, not because there was nothing to learn, but because everything important had already happened. Lydia whispered, "It feels like we've been holding something heavy, and only now remembered we could put it down." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as lamplight. "Fear is very heavy. Understanding is very light." The church clock chimed the hour. Not ominous, just time. The villagers turned toward their homes, slow, warm steps, not hurried ones. Miss Marple watched them go with quiet satisfaction. And as she stood alone in the village green beneath the thin moon, she said softly to the night, "You never wanted to frighten them. They simply did not know your language yet." The night, relieved to be believed in correctly, said nothing at all. Chapter 10. The Trap. They gathered at dusk, as if for a village rehearsal. No hymn sheets this time. Only instructions Miss Marple had written on a postcard in the neat spool-room hand that made even trouble behave. "We will separate the night into pieces," she had told them at tea. "When a fear is made of parts, it stops pretending to be a monster." Thomas had chalked a small map on the green, the old ventilation shaft behind the mill, the yew lane where people swore whispers braided themselves, the chalk ridge above the quarry where blue glimmers had scared even practical men. Dr. Selene Park wore a canvas bag of decent, Instruments: sound meter, aneroid barometer, thermometer, a coil of red ribbon, and the expression of someone determined to be polite to physics. Chapter 10. At dusk, Miss Marple gathered the villagers for what looked like a rehearsal rather than an investigation. She handed out a postcard of instructions. They would divide the night into pieces: wind, wire, glow, until fear lost its disguise. Thomas chalked a map of the key sites: the ventilation shaft behind the mill, the yew lane known for its whispers, and the chalk ridge that shimmered with ghostly light. Dr. Celine Park brought her instruments: sound meter, barometer, thermometers, ribbons, while Lydia carried old maps and a letter revealing that a man named Mr. Dalrymple had been trying to buy cottages cheaply. Reverend Armitage came with a lantern and patience. Miss Marple's voice was clear. We begin with the wind, then the wire, then the glow. At the shaft they found the source of the village's haunting hum. The old baffles had been removed, turning the hill into a great resonant mouth. Park's meter recorded the infrasound 17 to 19 hertz, a frequency that unsettled the body but not the ear. The frequency of unease, she said. Miss Marple had Mr. Roper replace the baffles, and the sound vanished, leaving only an ordinary draft. Fear first unhooked, she said, and led them on to the yew lane. There, between the dark branches, Park's fingers found a piano wire stretched taut, tuned to vibrate with the breeze. When plucked, it moaned like a ghost's breath. Lovely engineering, Park muttered. Miss Marple tied a red ribbon and ordered it cut. The false haunting sighed into silence. Next came the chalk ridge, where villagers had seen blue lights moving like lost souls. Under Miss Marple's calm instruction, Park and the others proved the glow came from friction. Chalk dust mixed with flint crumbs produced brief blue sparks, triboluminescence. They discovered lime powder and a paintbrush near a sheep gate, proof someone had staged the phenomenon. Fear likes a chorus, Miss Marple said. A note in the hill, a ghost in the hedge, a light on the ridge. It was time to meet the conductor. As they descended, they spotted a lantern in the yew lane. Dalrymple himself, caught mid-performance. Sir Rowland arrived with Lydia's letter, and others proving his scheme. Remove the baffles, string wires, scatter lime, all to spread fear, drive down property values, and buy cottages cheaply. Miss Marple confronted him gently but firmly. You have arranged very pretty noises. When he tried to deny it, Park illuminated the lime on his cuffs, evidence of his handiwork. He stumbled. Mr. Roper steadied him with quiet civility. There was no need for shouting. The proof was clear. They took him to the vestry, seated him beneath a notice reading, Draw in quiet, pour in thanks. Sir Rowland promised due process. Miss Marple poured water for their subdued prisoner. Outside the wind calmed, the ridge stilled, and the village exhaled. Park smiled at the silence in her sound meter. The village will sleep, she said. It will sleep better, Miss Marple replied. She told Thomas to write on the school slate, When the dark speaks, ask what it is made of, and if asked what to do with fear, she said, Give it work. The night, properly understood, no longer needed to pretend to be haunted. The night after Dalrymple's arrest came gently to Roanford, quiet, ordinary, and miraculous. For the first time in weeks, no one rushed to shutter windows or bolt doors. The village simply settled into calm. Miss Marple walked the lanes at twilight, listening not for threats, but for peace. The mill's flue was padded, the orchard breathed softly, and the hedges no longer hummed. Dr. Park tested the well water, no infrasound, no pressure spikes, no illusions. And Miss Marple observed that shadows retire when there's no one left to applaud. Thomas arrived, cheerful, reporting that the children now walked home unafraid, and Reverend Armitage offered thanks. Miss Marple reminded him that she had only helped them, remember how to listen. The stars rose, steady and unthreatening. Without announcement, the villagers took what became the night walk of thanks. They stepped outside together. No torches, no fear, just the wish to share a night reclaimed from dread. Miss Marple walked among them, not leading or guarding, but belonging. In the orchard, once a place of terror, Mrs. Alden placed her hand on an old apple tree and realized it was not haunted but forgotten. "It was always a friend," she said. "I simply forgot how to greet it." Fear had not vanished, it had been retrained. They continued through the hedged lane where once invisible wires had hummed ghostly songs. Now only leaves whispered, and Mr. Roper tapped a trunk approvingly. "Trees are speaking sensibly again," Park replied. "They always did. It was our translations that were faulty." Laughter rose softly. They stood still, hearing only the clean quiet of the night. Miss Marple breathed in stillness itself. At last they climbed the chalk ridge, careful but unafraid. The moonlight revealed no false glows, no flint sparks, no painted tricks. They rested together under a peaceful sky, Thomas, Lydia, Armitage, Roper, Park, and Miss Marple. "Do you hear it?" she asked. They listened not for noise, but for peace. The owl's call, rustling grass, and the earth's cool exhale formed a silence that was not emptiness, but presence. Back on the green, no one hurried home. They lingered, speaking softly, remembering how fear once lived here, but didn't belong. Armitage looked at the moon and said, "It seems smaller tonight." Miss Marple answered, "No, we have simply enlarged the dark again." The moon never watched us. We were watching ourselves. Lydia promised they would remember this night. "You will," Miss Marple said, "because it asked nothing of you except to breathe." And so Rowanford breathed. For the first time in many nights, it slept without performing fear. The night was not defeated or explained away, it was understood. And that understanding, quiet and complete, was enough. Morning arrived gently in Rowanford, as though peace had always belonged there. Sunlight spread across rooftops, dew shimmered on orchard leaves, and no one checked their shutters before breathing. Miss Marple sat in Lydia's kitchen over tea and marmalade, the silence companionable. Thomas entered, bright and rested, saying even the hens looked happier. Lydia laughed. Dr. Celine Park arrived next, setting her sound meter on the table off, but present. "If there's infrasound today," she said, "it'll be from the cows." Miss Marple smiled, amused and calm. "We've put things right," she said. "Now we must remember not to put them wrong again." When Thomas asked how, she replied, "By remembering two things. Sounds are only sounds, and stories make them more." The truth felt ancient, rediscovered. Outside, the church bell chimed 9 with dignity, not drama. Later, Sir Rowland met them at the green, shoulders lighter. Dalrymple had been taken to town for questioning fraud, coercion, manipulation. "He frightened people for profit," Thomas said. Sir Rowland agreed, but Miss Marple reminded them the culprit mattered less than the pattern. "If Rowanford remembers how the dark played tricks, it won't fall again." Lydia mused that memory could be a shield. Park added, "Or a mirror, or a gate," Miss Marple said. Armitage arrived with a hammer, saying, "The church drain was clear. The cold spot was only shade." Roper followed, reporting the mill cap sealed, the hedge trimmed, the wire gone. No more ghosts for hire. Miss Marple looked at them all, Park, Lydia, Thomas, Roper, Armitage, Rowland, and saw not victors but caretakers. Rowanford was whole again. In the days that followed, the village practiced peace. Children walked the orchards with baskets. Elders sat on benches where fear once lingered. The church bell rang as it should. Roper led small repairs so no foolishness could learn the tune again. Mrs. Alden brought Miss Marple scones in gratitude. "You did the hard part," Miss Marple said, "believing you no longer needed to be afraid." Thomas wrote it down as a lesson. Evenings softened into normal rhythm, the crickets sang, the jug rippled only when touched, and shadows stayed in their place. One dusk, Miss Marple walked the lane and sat beneath the old yew. The gathering night felt companionable, not ominous. She listened not for danger, but for life simply continuing. The village, she realized, had learned to trust itself again. When she finally prepared to leave, there was no ceremony, only gratitude. Lydia walked beside her. Thomas carried her small case. Park shook her hand. Armitage blessed her. Roper tipped his cap. Sir Rowland nodded. "Will you write?" Lydia asked. "When there's something worth writing," Miss Marple smiled. Thomas asked what to do if fear returned. "Ask what it's made of," she said simply. The train pulled away, and through the window, Rowanford gleamed in morning light. No haunted village, no cursed valley, just a place that remembered how to breathe. Miss Marple folded her hands, her smile small and certain. Fear leaves slowly. Understanding arrives all at once, and peace only waits to be recognized.